Frank arrived home to find a massive stone blocking his driveway, its surface emblazoned with bright orange letters. "Bonne fête, Isa," it read. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Bewildered, he wondered what could have prompted such a bizarre gesture. The enormity of the rock matched the growing pit in his stomach. As soon as Frank discovered the story behind this stone, he called his lawyer with trembling hands. This was an absolute nightmare, and it completely turned his life upside down. "What the heck is this?" Frank said out loud when he saw the huge stone on his driveway. He parked his car across the street and got out, unable to believe his eyes. After waiting for a few cars to pass, he crossed the road and approached the rock, and his mouth fell open when he finally saw what was written on it. There was no doubt about it. This was meant for his wife, Isabella. He took his phone and dialed her number, but she didn't pick up. Frank just stood there, staring at that massive rock, while he tried calling her again, but each time the call disconnected after a few beeps. He finally gave up and walked around the rock a couple of times, even touching it once, trying to make sense of it. Frank was completely confused. He Googled the words that were written on it, "Bonne fête," and he discovered that it was a way to say "Happy Birthday" in Canada, which just so happened to be the destination of Isabella's last business trip. He assumed that this was some kind of gift from one of his wife's colleagues, or perhaps a new friend she had made there, but he would find out the truth soon enough. A loud noise finally pulled him out of his thoughts and back to reality, and it took him a few seconds to realize that it was his ringtone. Isabella was calling him. He quickly picked up and said, "Hi, honey. When are you coming home?" Not mentioning the rock to her yet. He wanted to see her honest first reaction when she saw it. Isabella said that she was just finishing up work and she would be home soon, and Frank told her he'd start preparing dinner while he waited. And he did. He washed and cut up some vegetables, all while looking through the window, keeping an eye out for her car. As soon as he saw her drive into the street, he dropped everything and ran to the front door. His wife's reaction wasn't what he had expected, really. She stared at the rock with wide eyes and asked, "Frank, did you do this?" Without even looking at him. He wasn't sure what to say, so he just said nothing while she, too, approached the rock and walked around it, surprised. "Honey, How did you know?" she then said, and Frank noticed she had tears in her eyes. At this moment, she finally looked up and met his gaze. He must have looked as confused as he felt, because Isabella immediately pulled herself together. She cleared her throat and blinked a few times while she smoothed over her blouse. Frank was just about to ask her what she was talking about, but she interrupted him and said, "Oh, it's nothing. Don't worry about it." She then put on a smile that Frank recognized to be fake. He knew her better than anyone else after all those years together, gave him a kiss on the cheek, and went inside the house, leaving her husband alone on the porch. This hadn't gone as he had expected at all, and he was only more confused now. He was sure that something strange was going on, and he would get to the bottom of it. He found Isabella in the kitchen, finishing the dinner he had started earlier. She gave him a quick smile but avoided his gaze afterward, and when Frank came to stand behind her and put his arms around her like he so often did while they were cooking, she slowly pushed him away. She never did that, not even when she was upset. Now he knew that this was something much more serious than he had first thought. "Izzy, can we talk?" he asked her in bed later that night. He really wanted to know the story behind that rock and who had sent it to her, but it was obvious that she didn't want to talk about it. "I'm tired. Sorry." "Talk tomorrow?" she replied, and she didn't even wait for his answer before turning off her nightlight and going to sleep. The next morning, Frank woke up to find Isabella already gone, her work bag and car missing. He lay in bed for a moment, processing the empty space beside him. The events of last night replayed in his mind, and a sense of unease settled in his stomach. He finally got up, hoping to find some clue or explanation for Isabella's behavior. But there was nothing. He sighed and started his morning routine, the unanswered questions lingering. The house was empty with no note left behind. Frank assumed Isabella had gone to work. He wandered through the silent rooms, feeling the absence of her presence more acutely than usual. The kitchen was tidy, the bed made, but no sign of her anywhere. He checked his phone for messages, but there were none. The house felt strangely hollow, and the events of the previous night weighed heavily on his mind. Frank got ready for his day, feeling uneasy about the previous evening's events. The rock, Isabella's strange reaction, and her evasiveness replayed in his head. He showered, dressed, and made a quick breakfast, all the while glancing at his phone, hoping for a message from her. The silence was unsettling, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. He finished his coffee and decided to face the day, hoping for clarity later. He stepped outside, noticing the rock still on the porch, and took a photo of it. The bright orange letters seemed even more out of place in the morning light. Frank circled the rock, looking for any new clues, but found none. He sent the photo to his lawyer, hoping for some insight, then stood there for a moment, staring at the bizarre gift. The rock was a puzzle, and he needed to solve it. Frank left for work, the strange rock and Isabella's behavior occupying his thoughts. The drive was a blur as his mind raced with questions and concerns. When he arrived at his office, he found it hard to concentrate, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the rock and his wife's unusual reaction. The day stretched on, each hour feeling longer than the last. Frank knew he needed answers, and he hoped tonight would bring some clarity. At work, Frank struggled to focus, distracted by thoughts of Isabella and the mysterious rock. His mind kept drifting back to the strange events at home. He found himself staring at his computer screen, unable to concentrate on his tasks. His colleagues noticed his distraction, but he brushed off their concerns with forced smiles. The rock, Isabella's reaction, and the unanswered questions gnawed at him, making it hard to get through the day. He anticipated the evening, eager to talk to Isabella and get some answers. As the day dragged on, his impatience grew. He kept glancing at the clock, willing the hours to pass faster. He replayed the conversation in his head, planning what he would say. By the time his shift ended, Frank was ready to confront the mystery head-on. He hoped that tonight he would finally understand what was going on. Returning home, Frank was shocked to find the rock had disappeared. The spot where it had sat was now empty, as if it had never been there. He walked around the porch, looking for any signs of it, but there were none. Confused and a bit alarmed, he went inside, calling out for Isabella. He needed to know what had happened to the rock and why it was gone. The mystery only deepened. Isabella was already home, having prepared dinner, smiling as if nothing was wrong. The delicious smell of a home-cooked meal filled the house, and she greeted Frank with a cheerful, "Hi, honey, how was your day?" Her calm demeanor and bright smile clashed with the confusion swirling in Frank's mind. He tried to read her expression, searching for any hint of the turmoil he felt. She acted like everything was perfectly normal. Frank asked her about the rock, but she simply smiled and told him not to worry about it. "It's nothing, Frank," she said lightly. "Just a little surprise." Frank frowned, not satisfied with her answer. "But it was so strange, Isa. Where did it go?" She just shrugged and repeated, "Don't worry about it." Frank felt frustration rising but decided to drop it for now, not wanting to spoil the evening. Frank insisted on talking about the rock, but Isabella got annoyed and asked him to respect her boundaries. "Frank, I've told you not to worry about it. Can't we just enjoy our evening?" she snapped. Frank, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion, tried to push further, but Isabella's tone made it clear she was done with the topic. He reluctantly agreed, though the mystery still gnawed at him. Frustrated, Frank went to bed alone while Isabella slept on the couch. The silence in the house was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved questions. Frank lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He couldn't understand why Isabella was so secretive about the rock. After a while, he drifted into a restless sleep, feeling more distant from his wife than ever before. In the middle of the night, Frank woke up, needing to use the bathroom. He groggily got out of bed and made his way to the bathroom, trying not to wake Isabella. As he finished and washed his hands, he heard a faint noise that made him pause. It sounded like a voice, and it was coming from the hallway. His heart started to pound as he listened closely. He heard a voice in the hallway and realized Isabella was talking to someone. Frank's curiosity piqued, and he quietly crept closer to the door, trying to make out what was being said. The murmur of conversation was soft, but unmistakable. He couldn't hear the words clearly, but he knew it was Isabella. Who could she be talking to at this hour? His mind raced with possibilities. Quietly, Frank approached the living room and stood around the corner to listen. He held his breath, straining to hear the conversation. Isabella's voice was calm, almost affectionate, and Frank caught snippets of what she was saying. He felt a knot form in his stomach as he heard her laugh softly. The mystery of the rock was suddenly overshadowed by a new, more pressing question. Who was Isabella talking to in the middle of the night? Frank heard Isabella speaking in French, recognizing only the words "mon amour," and froze. His heart sank as the familiar endearment echoed in his mind. He stood there, paralyzed, unable to move or process what he had just heard. The affectionate tone in her voice was unmistakable, and a cold wave of dread washed over him. He strained to hear more, but those two words were enough to shatter his world. Suspecting an affair, Frank's mind raced with possibilities and confusion. His thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and betrayal. Who was she talking to? Why was she using such intimate language? The rock, the secretive behavior, everything suddenly made a disturbing kind of sense. He felt his pulse quicken as anger and hurt mixed together, leaving him feeling sick. He needed to confront her, but he had to know more first. He entered the room, startling Isabella, who quickly ended the call. She looked up, eyes wide with surprise and a hint of guilt. "Frank, what are you doing up?" she asked, her voice strained. Frank felt a surge of anger but kept his tone calm. "I heard you talking. Who was that?" Isabella fumbled with her phone, avoiding his gaze. The air was thick with tension as Frank waited for her to respond. Frank demanded to know who she was talking to, and she claimed it was just a colleague. "It was nobody, Frank. Just a work call," she said, her voice shaky. He didn't buy it. In the middle of the night? Speaking French? He saw her wince at his words. "Yes, it's for an international project," she insisted, but Frank could see the cracks in her story. "I don't believe you," he said flatly. Furious and feeling deceived, Frank stormed back to bed without another word. His mind was a storm of emotions, but he knew he couldn't deal with it now. The betrayal stung deeply, and he felt a wall building between them. As he lay down, he heard Isabella moving around in the other room, but he didn't care. He closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, Frank tried to read Isabella's messages while she slept, but found her phone locked. He had hoped to get some answers without confrontation. The locked screen taunted him as he held the phone, the blue light glowing faintly in the dim room. He glanced at Isabella, still sleeping peacefully, and his frustration grew. He placed the phone back carefully, his suspicions deepening with each passing moment. He discovered she had changed her phone password, adding to his suspicions. Frank knew Isabella's old password, and the fact that she had changed it without telling him was another red flag. He felt a pang of betrayal, wondering what she was hiding. The secrecy, the late-night calls, and now this. It all pointed to something serious. His determination to uncover the truth only intensified. Frank met with a friend who worked with Isabella and mentioned her Canada trip. Over coffee, he casually brought up the topic, watching his friend's reaction closely. "Oh, that trip to Canada. Isabella went on for work, remember?" he said, trying to sound nonchalant. His friend's confused look spoke volumes. "Canada? I don't recall any work trip to Canada," the friend replied, frowning. Frank's heart sank as his suspicions were confirmed. His friend revealed there was no business trip to Canada, that it was personal. "She didn't go for work, Frank. She took personal leave," his friend explained, clearly puzzled by Frank's surprise. Frank's mind raced. Why had Isabella lied about the trip? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but he didn't like the picture they were forming. He thanked his friend, his mind now consumed with thoughts of betrayal. Feeling betrayed, Frank knew Isabella was lying to him. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He had trusted her completely, and now everything seemed like a lie. The rock, the late-night call, the changed password. It all made sense now. As he drove home, his thoughts were a chaotic mix of anger, hurt, and confusion. He needed to confront Isabella, but he wasn't sure how. The next day, Frank saw part of Isabella's phone password as she unlocked it. He watched from the corner of his eye, pretending to be engrossed in a book. She typed quickly, but he caught the first few digits. His heart raced as he realized this might be his chance to uncover the truth. He stayed calm, not wanting to arouse suspicion, and waited for the right moment to act. Memorizing it, he waited for her to shower and then took her phone. As soon as he heard the water running, Frank quietly slipped into the bedroom and grabbed her phone from the nightstand. His hands shook slightly, with a mix of nerves and anticipation. He needed to know what Isabella was hiding, and this was his chance. He sat on the edge of the bed, ready to unlock the secrets. After several tries, he managed to unlock it, feeling a mix of fear and determination. The screen finally lit up, granting him access. Frank took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew he had limited time before Isabella finished her shower. His heart pounded as he navigated through the apps, searching for answers. Each second felt like an eternity, but he was driven by the need to know the truth. Frank quickly went to her messages, searching for anything unusual. He scrolled through the conversations, his eyes darting over the screen. Most were mundane, but then he saw a chat with someone named Alex. The name didn't ring any bells, and his curiosity grew. He hesitated for a moment, then opened the conversation. His breath caught in his throat as he began to read through the messages. He found a chat with someone named Alex, a name he didn't recognize. The messages were numerous, filled with emojis and phrases that seemed intimate. Frank's heart pounded harder as he scrolled up, trying to piece together the context. The familiarity and warmth in the conversation were undeniable. He felt a pang of betrayal, his worst fears seemingly confirmed. He needed to know more about this mysterious Alex. Frank opened the chat, but found all the messages were in French. He stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar words. The flowing sentences and frequent use of affectionate emojis only deepened his unease. He scrolled through the conversation, his heart pounding with each passing message. Unable to understand, he knew he needed to translate them to uncover the truth behind Isabella's secret exchanges. Using a translation app, he was shocked by messages like, "I miss you, my love," and "I love you so much." Each translated phrase felt like a dagger to his heart. Frank read through the messages, the words confirming his worst fears. The intimate language and affectionate tone were undeniable. His hands trembled as he scrolled through, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal. Isabella had been lying to him all along. Frank realized this was likely the same person Isabella had spoken to on the phone. The pieces started to fit together. The late-night conversations, the secretive behavior, the rock. Alex was more than just a friend or colleague. The realization hit him hard, making him feel sick to his stomach. He couldn't believe Isabella had been so deceitful. He needed to take action, and he knew exactly what to do next. He felt disgusted, believing that Isabella was cheating on him. The messages left no doubt in his mind. The words of love exchanged with Alex were a betrayal of everything he thought he had with Isabella. Frank's thoughts swirled with anger and sadness, feeling the weight of his broken trust. I knew I couldn't stay in this marriage anymore. It was time to make a decision that would change everything. Frank immediately called his lawyer, Miss Stevens, and filed for divorce. His voice was steady, but filled with hurt as he explained the situation. "I need to end this, Miss Stevens," he said firmly. She listened carefully, offering her support and guidance. "We'll start the paperwork right away, Frank. It will take a few days," she assured him. Frank felt a sense of resolve, knowing this was the first step toward a new beginning. Ms. Stevens informed Frank the divorce paperwork would take a few days. He nodded, trying to mask the turmoil inside. "I understand. Thank you," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. The wait seemed endless, but he knew it was necessary. Frank felt a strange mix of relief and dread, knowing that soon he would take the first step toward ending his marriage. Frank decided not to confront Isabella yet, but instead investigate Alex's identity. He needed more information before making his next move. He couldn't shake the feeling that Alex was the key to understanding everything. With a plan in mind, he began his search, determined to uncover the truth behind the person who had come between him and Isabella. He searched all of Isabella's social media accounts and work laptop for any clue about Alex. Hours passed as he scrolled through posts, photos, and messages. He examined every detail, hoping to find some connection or mention of Alex. His frustration grew with each fruitless search, but he pressed on, driven by a need to know who this person was and how they fit into Isabella's life. Despite thorough searching, Frank found nothing about Alex. There were no tagged photos, no mentions in posts, nothing that linked Isabella to this mysterious person. It was as if Alex didn't exist. The lack of evidence only deepened his frustration and suspicion. He felt like he was chasing shadows, but he couldn't give up. He needed answers, even if they seemed out of reach. Frank grew increasingly obsessed, wondering who Alex was. The name haunted his thoughts, day and night. He replayed the translated messages in his mind, the affectionate words that tore at his heart. He found himself drifting through the days, his focus entirely consumed by the mystery. The need to uncover Alex's identity became an obsession, pushing him to the brink of desperation. Ms. Stevens called Frank, informing him the divorce papers were ready. He listened carefully, her words confirming the reality he was about to face. "You can pick them up today," she said. Frank thanked her, feeling a heavy weight settle in his chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. He knew what he had to do, and he steeled himself for the confrontation ahead. Frank picked up the papers from her office and prepared for Isabella's return. He drove home, the envelope feeling heavy in his lap. As he entered the house, he placed the papers on the kitchen table, staring at them for a moment. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He took a deep breath, readying himself for the difficult conversation to come. He waited at the kitchen table, tension building as he anticipated her reaction. Every passing minute felt like an hour. He glanced at the clock repeatedly, his thoughts racing. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and insistent. The envelope sat in front of him, a tangible representation of his heartbreak. He tried to stay calm, but the uncertainty of her response gnawed at him. Isabella arrived, sensing Frank's anger and seriousness immediately. She stepped through the door, her smile fading as she saw him at the table. "Frank, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. He didn't respond, his eyes fixed on her. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and she could feel the weight of his gaze. She knew something was seriously wrong. She hesitantly sat down, asking, "What's wrong?" as Frank prepared to confront her. Her voice was soft, almost trembling. Frank looked at her, his expression hardening. "We need to talk, Isabella," he said, his tone cold and distant. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the envelope on the table. She had a sinking feeling that this conversation was going to change everything. Frank handed Isabella the divorce papers without a word, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened in shock as she took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She looked up at him, confusion and hurt etched on her face. Frank remained silent, his expression hard. He wanted to see how she would respond, what excuses she might come up with. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Isabella turned pale and asked if he was serious, bursting into tears when he confirmed. "Frank, are you serious?" she whispered, her voice breaking. He nodded, his jaw clenched. The reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks, and she couldn't hold back the tears. "How could you do this?" she cried, her voice filled with anguish. Frank felt a twinge of guilt, but stayed resolute. She asked if he didn't love her anymore, and Frank sarcastically asked the same. "Don't you love me anymore, Frank?" Isabella pleaded, tears streaming down her face. He met her gaze, his eyes cold. "Do you?" he shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Isabella's confusion deepened, but Frank saw it as an act. Isabella looked confused, but Frank believed she was just acting. "I don't understand," she stammered, her brow furrowed. Frank shook his head, feeling his anger rise. "Don't play dumb, Isabella. I know everything," he said harshly. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Frank's frustration grew, convinced that she was trying to manipulate him. The tension in the room was palpable. The atmosphere grew tense as Frank's accusations hung in the air. He stood up, pacing the kitchen, unable to stay still. Isabella watched him, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "Frank, please, tell me what's going on," she begged. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with anger. "You know exactly what's going on," he said quietly, the weight of his words hanging between them. Frank accused Isabella of having an affair and demanded she tell him about it. "I know you're cheating on me, Isabella. Who is it? How long has this been going on?" he shouted, his face flushed with anger. Isabella recoiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Frank, no, it's not what you think," she tried to explain, but he cut her off, his voice rising with frustration and hurt. He also asked if the person who sent the rock was her lover. "Is it Alex? Is he the one who sent that rock?" Frank demanded, his eyes boring into hers. Isabella shook her head, her hands trembling. "No, Frank, you've got it all wrong," she said, her voice breaking. Frank's anger only grew, convinced she was lying to him. "Then explain, Isabella. Explain everything right now," he insisted. Isabella denied any affair, but Frank became angrier, revealing he had read her chat with Alex. "I saw your messages, Isabella. I miss you, my love. I love you so much." "How do you explain that?" he yelled, throwing his hands up in exasperation. Isabella's face went pale, and she seemed to crumple under the weight of his words. "Frank, it's not what you think," she whispered. There was a long silence before Isabella broke down, crying uncontrollably. She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. Frank stood there, torn between anger and a deep, aching sadness. "Isabella, please, just tell me the truth," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. She slowly lowered her hands, her eyes red and swollen, and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She admitted she had wanted to tell him, but didn't know how. "I never wanted to hurt you, Frank," she said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to tell you everything, but I was so scared." Frank listened, his anger giving way to confusion and a desperate need to understand. "Tell me now, Isabella, please," he urged, his eyes locked on hers. She nodded, ready to reveal the truth. Isabella revealed that Alex was not her lover, but her son from a teenage pregnancy. "Alex is my son, Frank," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I had him when I was very young." Frank's eyes widened in shock. "Your son?" he repeated, his mind racing to process this new information. Isabella nodded, tears still glistening in her eyes. "Yes, my son," she confirmed softly. She explained her parents had forced her to give the baby up for adoption. "My parents made me give him up," Isabella continued, her voice filled with pain. "I had no choice back then. They thought it was the best thing for me, but it broke my heart." Frank listened, feeling a mix of empathy and guilt. He reached out, taking her hand in his, trying to offer some comfort. Alex had tracked her down and lived in Canada, which was why she visited. "He found me a few months ago," Isabella said, a small smile breaking through her tears. "He lives in Canada now, and that's why I went there, to meet him." Frank felt a wave of relief, realizing how wrong he had been. "Isabella, I had no idea," he said, his voice filled with regret. "The rock was an inside joke between them from the trip." "The rock was just a silly joke between us," Isabella explained, laughing through her tears. "We saw this huge rock on a hike, and he joked about giving me a rock for my birthday. I never thought it would cause so much trouble." Frank chuckled, feeling the tension ease. "I'm sorry, Isabella. I should have trusted you," he admitted. Frank forgave her, and they invited Alex to visit, integrating him into their lives. "I'm sorry too, Frank," Isabella said, squeezing his hand. "I should have told you everything sooner." Frank nodded, feeling a sense of peace. "Let's start fresh," he suggested. "Invite Alex to visit. I'd love to meet him." Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Frank," she whispered, as they embraced, ready to begin a new chapter together. Do you like this touching and surprising story? If so, we invite you to leave us a comment expressing your opinion. If you want to continue enjoying inspiring stories like this one, subscribe to our channel or check out the other videos shown at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for your cooperation,